Thanks. Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's actually the first time I've spoken in Oregon. I'm sorry, not in Oregon. I've actually spoken many times in Oregon, but my first time speaking in Portland, and my first time coming to this wonderful bookshop, Powell's, and it's really a treat. I've heard so much about it, so I'm just thrilled to be here and to see all of you turn out on a Wednesday night. I wanted to start with a quote from a politician, and the politician is somebody from the North Shore of Illinois, just outside of Chicago, and this is a quote where he's talking about Halliburton in war and the contracts they've gotten. So this is the quote. He talks about these contracts that were illegal by statute. He's speaking on the floor of Congress. He says he urges a high-level probe into the 30-year associational, personal and political between a particular politician and the company. And he asks whether asks him to consider the fact that the company had contributed money to the President's Club while Congress was considering whether to award another multi-million-dollar project to Brown & Root. Brown & Root is a subsidiary of Halliburton that does the work in war zones. And he noted that he says over here, why this huge contract has not been and is now not being adequately audited is beyond me. The potential for waste and profiteering under such a contract is substantial. And he talks about the fact that this company, has no receipts and they are overcharging, and he's really kind of upset. And the most interesting thing about this is that you might imagine this is Henry Waxman from Los Angeles talking about Iraq, but it isn't. It's actually Donald Rumsfeld in May 1966, and he's talking about Vietnam. So now remember that Donald Rumsfeld is and always has been a Republican, and the president he was referring to was Lyndon B. Johnson. And I say that because it's very important to note that Lyndon Johnson, as probably all of you know, was a Democrat. And in fact, the politicians that really ran the Vietnam War were Democrats rather than Republicans. Not that the Republicans didn't have a part to play in this. What I want to read for you next is a quote from September 10th, 2001. Let me get the right page here. And on September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld, now at the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense, says, "The topic today is an adversary that poses a serious threat to the security of the United States of America. That adversary is one of the world's last bastions of central planning. It governs by dictating 5-year plans. From a single capital, it attempts to impose its demands across time zones, continents, oceans, and beyond." You may think I'm describing one of the last decrepit dictators of the world, he says. He said also, it disrupts the defense of the United States and places the lives of men and women in uniform at risk. The adversary is close at home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy. The technology revolution has transformed organizations across the private sector, but ours, not fully, not yet. We are, as they say, tangled in our anchor chain. We must ask tough questions. Why is it that the DoD, the Pentagon, is one of the last organizations around the world that still cuts its own checks? When an entire industry exists to run warehouses around the world, why do we own and operate so many of our own? At bases around the world, why do we pick up our own garbage and mop our own floors rather than contracting services out as many businesses do? I make this comment simply partly to show the transition between Rumsfeld, the opposition politician in the 1960s, and 35 years later, where he's embraced the idea of using Halliburton and Brown & Root in the war in Iraq. But also because Halliburton's Army, the book was originally called Halliburton's War, but in fact I realized partway through writing this book that I was making a mistake. And this isn't really about a war for Halliburton or by Halliburton, it's a war that is actually conducted by Halliburton in some ways. And I'll explain that. If you go to Iraq today, there are 300,000 people supporting the US military. About a half of those are soldiers, and the other half are private contractors. So for every soldier, there is a private contractor. And contrast this to the first Gulf War, where there was 1 in perhaps 20 people that was a private contractor. So what Rumsfeld had intended when he spoke in 2001 has happened. Today, half of the work in the field is actually done by private contractors. And out of the 150,000 people that are there in Iraq, private contractors, 50,000 work for what was part of Halliburton, but now is a separate company called KBR. So technically Halliburton has gone from Iraq. Its former subsidiary, this was the company that worked in Vietnam, is now a totally different company in Houston, and they're called KBR. So today if you go out and you call Halliburton and say, what are you doing in Iraq? Are you profiteering? They'll say, we've never been in Iraq. It's a kind of an astonishing statement, but that's the statement they make. We've never been there. It's always been this company called KBR, and they're a completely separate company now. So you might wonder how this happened and whether or not this was simply, the question people always ask me is they say, what did Cheney have to do with this? Did Cheney give them the contract? Is he making trillions? Somebody said trillions, which is a large sum of money. They said no bid contracts. This is all illegal. They're doing they're doing very bad services for the troops. There's bad water. People are getting electrocuted. They're overcharging. And people ask me to speak about this and explain this. And now I've personally been to Iraq now 4 times, to Afghanistan a couple of times, to Kuwait, Dubai. And the last time I went to Iraq, I embedded with the US military. So when I said I wanted to observe military logistics up close, and they said fine, and they invited me in, and I got to meet Halliburton's Army in person and see exactly what happened. And when I emerged from that, somebody the other day when I gave this talk, somebody said, you've been seduced, the military has bought you up. What I want to say here is, I think I've learned something very different from what I set out to believe about the profiteering, the no-bid contracts. And that's why I brought it back to Rumsfeld. This, as the subtitle of the book suggests, which is how a well-connected Texas oil company revolutionized the way America makes war, is really about a change in the way the US military does business. So today, if you go to Iraq and you, as a soldier or as a diplomat or if you're Barack Obama is probably going to go to Iraq. He's been to Iraq and he's been to Afghanistan. He's probably going to go pretty soon. When he arrives in Iraq, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to meet people from KBR. When he sits down to eat, the food that he eats will be cooked by people from KBR, ex-Halliburton. If he travels in a convoy, between the airport and the green zone, it's going to be driven by KBR people. If he were to, when we travel between bases, the flight manifests were written by civilians. So everything there, the building of the bases, the cooking of the food, the cleaning of the toilets, everything that is mundane, that doesn't involve firing a gun, is done by the workers of KBR. So how did this happen? How did this transformation take place? I mean, was this something that the neocons introduced, that Cheney introduced purely for profit? The answer actually is a little more complicated and I think much more interesting. That's kind of what the book is about.